Hello, good evening. I'm from the Thinking Slow group. I wanted to make a presentation about the statistics that we're being fed on COVID at the moment. And the reason I wanted to do that is a lot of those statistics are very misleading, and they've been cherry-picked, and they've been cherry-picked to support a particular narrative, which is a very inaccurate narrative. And I wanted to give you sort of real data and show you essentially where we are. And I think where we are is very different to the impression that you've been given. So starting off with the first story, that where we are now in this second wave, it's significantly worse than the first wave, and this is now really the time to more or less to panic. That's not true at all. Here on the chart is the Office of National Statistics data for daily deaths involving COVID, and you can see pretty clearly that if you sort of draw a line in the middle and split the first wave from the second wave, the daily rate of death in the first wave was roughly double where we are now, and where we are now is in mid-January. The data's a little bit late. That's not deliberate. It's just because the ONS data comes out a little bit late. But in terms of deaths, the first wave is slightly less than double the second wave, and the excess deaths in the first wave are much more than double the second wave as of mid-January. And that's not the impression I don't think you're going to have from the media and from the politicians. They've made a very big deal of where we are now, and it actually, looking at that chart, you can see thankfully it's not as serious as the position in April. And just going on from that, this is another way also of looking at this first and second wave. This is the weekly deaths. The red bar are for non-COVID reasons, and the blue part of the bars are deaths involving COVID. Again, you see the same pattern, a very significant first wave, and a much less important, significant second wave. And the important thing here is the green line, which is the 5-year average of weekly deaths. During the first wave, basically all of those deaths there were above, all of the COVID deaths were above the 5-year average. And there was quite a big contribution as well of non-COVID deaths above the 5-year average. So you had a lot of excess deaths in that first wave. That's not the case for the second wave, and very briefly, that's due to the fact that you have a very significant reduction in deaths from influenza and respiratory diseases. Sort of overall for the year, that's 7,500 deaths less than you would expect. So whatever deaths you have from COVID, a significant number of those are sort of offset by a reduction in influenza and deaths from respiratory diseases. So that's why that second wave, your excess deaths are actually quite a bit less than the deaths from COVID. As an example, like week 1 of this year, roughly speaking, you have about 5,000 COVID deaths, but you've got about a 1,500 reduction in deaths from influenza and respiratory diseases. So your excess death figure will be about 3,500, which is less than the COVID headline death number. And I hope that sort of makes sense, that why, from an excess deaths point of view, the first wave is much higher than the second. And I'll do some more work later about this second wave, because there's quite a lot of things going on in that end section of the curve, but that's for another time. And then here is an illustration of the sort of cherry picking of misleading data, essentially. And we'll look at a few examples, but basically it's very important to be aware that there's a time series on the dashboard, which is the deaths or even cases by date reported, and that's the number that all the media and the politicians jump up and down on. And it's easiest to explain with some charts, but basically If you have something like a long weekend or a bank holiday weekend, you don't have much reporting of deaths or cases, but let's say just deaths. So then you come to a day on a Monday or a Tuesday where all of a sudden you'll report a whole series of deaths, and you end up with a very large number. That date reported has no correspondence, or very little correspondence, to how many people died actually on that day. It's just a question of how many did you disclose on that day. And what we find is that you're disclosing about 40% more than actually died on that day. And it's a very misleading time series. I don't even know why it's there. My only hypothesis is it's specifically included there to create those high one-off misleading numbers that politicians and media then use to create a distorted picture of reality. And I'll walk through a couple of examples. You can see there's a huge difference between those data points as reported and the data points when things actually happened, which is the date of occurrence. So here is an example. This was the famous first large number that came out, 1,564 deaths on the 13th of January. That was UK. That translates into 1,400 for England. And I mean, you could tell from these time series, which are the sort of daily deaths under Office of National Statistics, under the dashboard, and under NHS, which were all sort of moving together. There was kind of no way you would get to 1,400 from when this time series ended to the 13th of January. Just not really possible. And yes, it did go up, but it went to actually just less than 1,000. So 1,400 was basically, again, a 40% inflation of the number of people who actually died on the 13th of January. And it sounds like splitting hairs, but actually is important, because those headline numbers are driving a lot of fear, basically, and creating a very distorted picture. Then here's another check of, if the UK numbers were sort of accurate, then you'd expect, to some extent, the death curve to look the same across countries. But what you actually see is the UK looks nothing like any other country. So other countries that had a first spike, that they have also a second spike. The second spike is noticeably, or at least slightly lower, or noticeably lower than the first spike. And the number of deaths, or daily deaths, starts going down from early November onwards. And the UK, you can see, is completely the opposite. The second spike is significantly higher than the first spike. And rather than going down, the number of daily deaths is exploding upwards. I can't prove this, but I'm pretty sure that it will eventually turn out to be manipulation of the as-reported deaths, that they actually relate to earlier periods. And when you translate that chart into deaths by date of occurrence, you probably get a sort of meaningful second peak, maybe in mid-November, and not have this explosion that you have now going into we're on the 21st of January now, and it really doesn't make any sense. So I can't prove this now, but I'm saying this is a very distorted picture, and the deaths by date of occurrence will not confirm this. This will have to be revised, and you won't get this picture when you get the true numbers. This is then one of the final illustrations on this point, but this sort of brings together that if you're using the Office of National Statistics number, which is the dotted blue line, you'll see all of the deaths, and those will include the deaths in the first wave where there wasn't testing available, and those numbers are missing from the dashboard numbers. So the dashboard flattens the first wave pretty significantly because it excludes a large number of deaths, and then the second part here is exactly, you can see what I was talking about, the very erratic, wildly erratic up-down of the deaths by date reported. it regularly goes from 1,500 to 500 to 1,500 to 500. So the politicians and the media choose 1,500, and they will drum that into you through the radio, through headlines, through statements in Parliament. It's a completely misleading number. It's totally misleading, and I think the last example was 40% overstated. I mean, that's reasonable rule of thumb, but it's the whole concept of providing those misleading numbers that I find most irritating, rather than the numbers themselves. Another number that is highly suspicious is the 80,000 cases that the Prime Minister referred to as we were going into more lockdown. If you look at the percentage positivity, which is the number of cases divided by the number of tests, that absolutely blew up to nearly 24% for one day to generate that 80,000 cases, and then fell back immediately the next day back into sort of low teens. That to me looks very, very unusual. And then you look at the way that the time series works: 45,000, 80,000, 70,000, and you're back to 52,000 in the space of 4 days. I find that highly suspicious, and I believe it's very likely that somehow those case numbers were sort of aggregated up to give, again, a big headline number, but there's just very unlikely that this accurately reflects the movement of a virus. So I can't say that for sure, but I can say that the way that those data points move is very suspect. I wouldn't buy this. I don't believe it. I don't believe it. I believe that for some reason, for one way or another, data was collected, bundled into a certain day to give a high number for one day that then falls away straight away afterwards. And then this is a little bit more on cases. Just to say, from this chart, you can see that if cases and deaths and hospital admissions with COVID sort of more or less coincided at one point when you reset them all to 1, at this stage now the number of cases is exploding. We're up at about this 80,000 a day level. So they've gone up sort of 8-fold, 9-fold, and that's not the case for deaths. Deaths have gone up into the second wave, but they're still lower than the first wave on ONS data. But the case numbers and deaths have completely diverged. So the case numbers don't have really any reflection in reality as far as I can determine. And this chart gives you a hint as to why that might be. This is the analysis of this famous mutant variant where you have this breakdown of cases of SGTF by age, and then I've superimposed on that the infection fatality ratio by age from the Center of Disease Control of the US. And the reason I do that is because I think their number is more realistic than what we have in our models here. And I've also scaled it down to 0.25 infection fatality ratio, which is the midpoint provided by the Center of Evidence-Based Medicine. But the important point is that you'll see that the average age of these cases is 35, and the vast bulk of them are essentially very limited stroke zero risk of hospitalization, very low risk of hospitalization, almost zero risk of death. So you generate these enormous case numbers, but really have very little impact on deaths or hospitalization. And I think that's really, again, that just goes back to why you have that big divergence now with case numbers going up by 9, but deaths really not going up by a similar factor. This is really part of the reason for that. And just before leaving this, I wanted to say, I'll do a separate podcast on this, that there's no difference in fatality or hospitalization between B117 and regular COVID. This whole thing has also been blown out of all proportion, and I'll get into that at another time. So that was then looking at the case numbers that I think are very unreliable and not reflected in reality. The last sort of number I want to pick into is the hospital admissions number. So a normal person would assume that COVID admissions means people admitted to hospital because of COVID. That's not the case. No. Roughly 1/4 of those admissions had a positive test before they came to hospital. The other 75% of COVID admissions were actually tested positive for COVID once they'd already been inpatients. Now, that made sense in the beginning when you didn't have testing capacity in the community, but now you're doing sort of 500,000 tests a day. It's sort of unthinkable that someone would get to hospital never having had a COVID test if he really was coming in for COVID. So that's sort of slightly complicated way of saying that, but I think essentially the orange area that you're seeing here towards the end, COVID is just incidental, and that would be actually a copy of what we saw in the first wave, that a lot of these admissions are COVID. It's a with COVID versus for COVID story again. Really only the blue bar, the blue section of this represents patients who are genuinely coming in because of COVID. For the others, it's incidental. So, and also I think with this statistic, if people are going to talk to you about admissions, you need to ask them about discharges. Because if you have 2,000 patients admitted on a day, it's pretty clear that if you discharge 3,000, that's fine to have 2,000. So again, this number in isolation means not that much. And we have another presentation on the website that dissects this a little bit further. But for now, it's enough to say, even be careful with hospital admissions for COVID. It doesn't mean what you think it means. We're bombarded with the information that the second wave is significantly worse than the first wave. We're sort of hit with these massive case numbers, 80,000 a day, and also then with these very large admissions numbers where we're not looking at admissions compared with discharges, we're just given a big admissions number. But then really this is more or less the only data set that cannot really be fiddled with, which is the excess deaths, which are very similar to the chart that I showed at the beginning. Well, in fact, this is the same, but it's broken down by region. And again, it's the big first wave. And then in the second wave, it's not significant. And you can see that the thing in the yellow box is the excess deaths you got from the August heat wave. And those are, that's comparable in size to what you're seeing towards the end of 2020. And yes, this went up. There's been another version of this a week or so ago that is a little bit higher. But on this version, you can tell that, at the end of 2020, when we were being sort of railroaded into a massive long lockdown, we did not have statistically significant excess deaths in 5 of the 9 regions as defined by Public Health England. So that's not to say people are not dying. Yes, they are dying. There are COVID deaths, but they're within, I think it's 2 standard deviations of what you would expect for this time of year. So again, it's the overall impression of sort of complete meltdown that we were given at the end of December is not borne out by this data set, which is really the only data set that cannot be fiddled, basically. So this is more of the reality versus what we actually been given by the media and by the government. So then just wrapping up, be careful of the data. Why is it like it is? And I think the answer to that is quite simple, that the government policy is to lie. If you look at the recommendations of SPI-B, which is a group of behavioral psychologists or psychiatrists who produced right at the beginning of a pandemic the advice that increase fear in order to increase compliance, essentially they're telling you that they're not going to present you with an objective assessment of COVID. They will twist, exaggerate, manipulate data in order to generate maximum fear including through this mass media campaign that we've all been subject to. And I think that explains to quite a large extent why the statistics that when you pick at them, you find they've all been mangled, and that's not surprising given this policy stance from the beginning. And then just going through, this is part of what we see all the time. This was SAGE's projections of winter deaths between 4,000 and 2,000 a day. The current level is about 600 a day if you take 87% of the ONS data. 87% I'll explain another time, but this is basically deaths, converting deaths involving COVID to deaths due to COVID. Roughly speaking, 87% is a reasonable conversion. So you can see the little dotted line. I think it's slightly in the wrong place, but it's more or less right. This was a projection that was only made in October, end of October, and it's basically wrong straight away. And it's just telling you again that SPI-M has got this wrong. And all those other scientists, the Yadens and the Levitts and the Guptas, have got this right, basically. We've had wrong from the beginning the attack rate of 80% and the infection fatality ratio of more than 1%. Those two core assumptions have been wrong. SPI-B have had wrong from the beginning, and they continue to get wrong. And then that's what feeds into the following. This is what we see all the time now. So you have the increasing case numbers, which really don't reflect anything too much in real life. So they can go up by a factor of 10 and nothing else is going up by a factor of 10. That's obviously driven by mass increase in testing up to 500,000 a day. So that's the background. And then these very high forecasts will come out. So I've done 5 of them here. First one, of course, was the 510,000 figure of unmitigated deaths. That number hasn't been matched anywhere in the world, even those countries with basically very little mitigation measures, very few non-pharmaceutical interventions. They do not have 80% times 1 something percent deaths. It just doesn't happen. Then you had the infamous 50,000 cases by mid-October. Again, a very short-term prediction or scenario, over a short period of time, the next 4 weeks. That was wrong by 100%. You've got the 2,000 to 4,000 deaths a day, which is actually somewhere about 600. So that's wrong by a factor of 3 to 6, basically. So putting all that together, then you have a situation of a sort of drumbeat of ever-increasing cases on the back of ever-increasing testing, which is now up to about 500,000 tests a day. And on that background, you then occasionally put in predictions which turn out to be wildly inaccurate, but at the time of the prediction they create an extra element of fear. So those are the 5 I've listed there. The first, obviously most famous one, was 510,000 deaths in an unmitigated pandemic. And that's not a number that's been borne out anywhere in the world, even with countries without any kind of non-pharmaceutical interventions. So 80% attack rate times 1 something percent infection fatality ratio has not been observed, really, as far as I can tell. So, and I think the projections of Professor Levitt have proven to be much more accurate than what we had. Then we had this infamous 50,000 cases predicted over really a short time frame, just the next 4 weeks. That was wrong by 100%. I mean, it was excused as a scenario, but everyone normal thinks that if you put a graph up and it shows numbers going into the future, you actually expect that to happen. You don't just sort of backtrack and walk away and say, well, that was actually a scenario which means nothing. It's not a credible explanation. We've had the deaths now, the chart I showed before, over winter, 2,000 to 4,000. Again, that was a very short-term prediction. It was only presented on the 30th of October. It was kind of wrong right from the beginning. It was massively overstated by a factor of about 3 to 6, or roughly speaking, overstated. Then you had this new mutant strain that, I mean, to be fair, it wasn't specifically said it was more deadly, but the sort of way it was presented and the language around it, this is deadly serious, this is out of control, so on and so forth. The intention was to present this as something very, very serious, as it turns out. Actually, it was known at the time that it has identical hospitalization and fatality to regular COVID. There's nothing there in terms of those two parameters. So again, more fear than fact on that. And then the last one was the prediction leaked out on London G&A beds, that they would be full by the... and then the last thing was the leaked projection concerning London G&A beds, that they would be full by the 7th of January, and there would be a deficit, i.e. there'd be more people requiring beds than existed, of between 1,500 and 4,400 by the 19th of January. Well, it's the 21st of January today, as far as I can see from the dashboard we have access to, which is in the Spectator. There's been a way to manage the G&A beds so that this did not happen, and actually that forecast was based on 4% daily compounding. And anyone that understands maths knows that if you compound something, in this case demand for hospital beds, at 4% every single day, it's only a question of time when you run out of capacity. So, a very dubious way of forecasting anything. And then you get those big, scary forecasts, and then that will be supported by the as-reported data that we've discussed, that you cherry-pick a data point and shout about that. Then you get all the key accounts coming out on Twitter with... surge, this is out of control, exponential, Porton down, all the usual buzzwords, creating even more fear. And then at that point, you get a bang, which is the change in policy, more restrictions for longer and harder. Of course, after that, nobody circles back to say, well, were those predictions right? And what happened to those as reported numbers? Because what we've seen is those predictions are not right, and those as reported numbers will fall by 40% plus minus to things on the date of occurrence. That was taking that 1,400 down to 1,000 and so on and so forth. So within a few days, these things turn out to be invalid. So, within a few days or a week or so, these forecasts become invalidated, but nobody circles around to say, well, actually, that was wrong. Let's now change the policy, which we've just tightened up. This process only goes in one direction, which is more fear, more restrictions for longer. And I think we need to essentially get out of that cycle. Just the final few words now. This is the evidence that lockdown doesn't work. The evidence is enormous and compelling. It's data-driven. On the lockdown's work, there isn't really a shred of evidence. The only thing we've seen is, something fell and lockdown happened before that, therefore lockdown caused it. Pretty infantile, really, explanation, doesn't really hold water, whereas the body of evidence against lockdown is compelling. And I think, at the end of the day, this is where we are. When you're hearing, the point of this presentation is to say, when you hear these big scary numbers, stop for a second and check, is this an as reported number? If it's something on the date of reporting, it's irrelevant and meaningless, so don't pay attention to it. look at the data for when things actually happened, which is the date of occurrence, and then again peel back further from there. If this is a hospital admission, is it someone who was admitted because they had COVID and needed treatment, or is it someone who was diagnosed incidentally in hospital? If I've got a big case number, what does that case number actually tell me? If the average age of those cases is 35, it's not going to tell me very much at all. So that was the point of this presentation is, as we pursue these fear-driven policies, take a step back from the numbers we're fed by the media and just, do the best you can to understand the definition of what's being said, because that basically allows you to pick and choose and cherry pick whatever number you want, essentially, particularly if the government policy is to behave dishonestly and generate fear. This was something they decided at the beginning, so they're not going to present things subjectively or be honest with the people. They will actually go out of their way to deliberately twist facts out of all recognition. So that was the main message from this presentation. The conclusions for us looking at all this going on is that lockdowns don't work. That's what the evidence says. Even if you can find any marginal benefit from this, the cost will massively outweigh this. And people keep screaming for a cost-benefit analysis, but hardly anyone has really looked at the SAGE minutes from July. There is a cost-benefit analysis in there from the Department of Health and Social Care, prepared with ONS. That already tells you from July 2020 that the negative impact from policy is greater than from COVID, and they have a ratio of 1.5 to 1. We think that actually the real answer, the ratio of 1.5 to 1, we think that actually the real answer is 5 to 1. And also what we've seen now is, we would actually like to definitely to stop this SPI-B PsyOps operation on the British public. Probably the most dishonest, harmful thing that a British government's ever done to its own people. This sort of psychological manipulation is obviously very popular in totalitarian systems, but I really find it pretty offensive that there's a group of generally left-wing political activist professors who are implementing this in the UK. I think it's very worrying. I think it's something that should be stopped as soon as possible. And also on the modelling side, that there are other modellers out there. It seems that the SPI-M is a tight-knit group. Their sources of funding are all from the same place. They're all coming up with the same numbers, and there's others out there that come up with different numbers that have turned out to be much more credible, and there should be some diversity of thought in this SPI-M group. And then lastly, I think for most people, the Great Barrington Declaration, signed by some incredibly important scientists, really is the only thing that makes sense. Restrict movement on some people versus restrict movement on all people. It seems to be a no-brainer. I've struggled to understand why it's been ignored, and those scientists who came up with that declaration have been ignored. That is even more amazing, because the qualifications of the Great Barrington Group versus the sort of lockdown group is night and day, to be frank. There's just no way we shouldn't, we should be listening to Great Barrington. We should absolutely be listening to those guys. And I think that's the end of this presentation. Sorry it's gone a bit long, but be very careful with these numbers. There's a lot of hype, a lot of spin, a lot of dishonest politicians supported by dishonest media pushing an agenda, making a narrative, using the policy developed by SPI-B. That's not the reality. Step back, look at some other indicators, and the picture you will form will be almost diametrically opposite to what you're told. So hopefully that was useful. Thank you very much. Goodbye.